China had a birthday party today. 15,000 members of its military were part of the processions that were happening in Beijing today. There was also a statement from the President for Life, which is that no one will be intimidating them. Nobody will be able to push back against China. Troy, we keep being told that any form of pushback against China equals displeasure, and there was a very smiling threat on the front page of the Australian newspaper today, just to remind us that, Chinese dreams are fueling the Australian economy. It's not a threat. I'm smiling while delivering the picture, was the Chinese ambassador on the front page of the Oz today.
Well, in many ways, he's right, that Australia's economic prosperity has been underpinned by the dramatic growth in the Chinese economy and its re-engagement with the world after a century or more of isolation. Those pictures were just extraordinary to see. The Chinese in Tiananmen Square, they're celebrating their 70th anniversary after the revolution from Mao Zedong. I was absolutely stunned, and the rolling out of the military hardware as well is quite a significant reminder of their increasing role that they want to play on the world stage, not only through economic but also through diplomatic and military power. Now, look, I've always been of the view we don't need to choose between the United States and China. We don't need to diminish our alliance or our relationship with the United States if we want to have a good economic and cultural relationship with China. That's the view that I've always taken. And we also need to make sure that we stand up for our own values and we don't diminish in any way our foreign policy. We need to stand up for a rules-based international order and all the rest of it. But, the idea that some people in the sort of foreign policy space and in the commentariat, and indeed some politicians, think that we need to choose between China or America, I think is just completely misplaced.
But what about Richard Marles, Deputy Shadow Defence Minister, in China last week, saying we should have closer defence ties with China?
Well, we do have defence ties with China. They had their ships in Sydney Harbour not so long ago.
Which came in unannounced on the Tiananmen Square anniversary.
Yeah, I think we've got to be careful about this. There are some people in the Australian foreign policy debate who need an enemy. They used to have Vietnam, they used to have Iraq. Those things didn't work out too well. And there seems to be a fair bit of feverish activity to define China as an enemy. China is not Australia's enemy. Australia, for 23 years after that day in 1949, didn't have diplomatic relations with China. And we wouldn't have any trade relations with them if we'd continued down that path. And China is not a perfect country, and of course it's very different to ours, but that's not unusual on the international scene. There are some things about China that should actually be celebrated, that really it was a nationalistic movement and not so much communism, because they developed all the capitalism to grow their economy, and in doing that they lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty.
Correct.
Which is one of the stellar achievements in international politics. So, you can take an attitude about China where you rattle the sabre towards them and you define them as an enemy. What Australia does about that, well, you can only contemplate the insanity of where that takes you. Otherwise, you should put China in proper perspective, a country with some very good things about it, some things that are not so good, some things that are very bad about it. And I think China's been crazy to try and run this foreign influence agenda in countries like ours. So I just think it's a matter of getting it in the right balance. But there is this sort of creeping undertow in the Australian commentary that somehow they're our enemy. Well, if you really think that, you've also got to think pretty carefully about where that's taking you. And I don't think any normal, sane analysts would actually go down that path.
Nick, why did you wince just there?
I think it's a brave attempt, Mark, to find the glass half full view of China. China is not, a good, half bad country. It's a thoroughly bad communist regime that treats its people in an inhuman manner, always has. And when you talk about lifting people out of poverty, sure, the introduction of a form of capitalism has allowed that to happen. But let's not forget, 30 million people died in the Great Leap Forward, which was a communist-induced nightmare brought about Mao Zedong. And let's not forget, it is exactly the same regime with exactly the same totalitarian
you're talking about the Great Leap Forward 50 years ago.
I think
50 years ago. This is
Mark, it's the same regime.
Yeah, but you would say in the Australian context we shouldn't be talking about the victim industry that says that you and I are responsible for what happened to Indigenous people in 19th century Australia. So going back 50 years ago in China is just Cold War stupidity. I've got to say, Cold War stupidity to go back that far. You wouldn't do it for Indigenous history in this country. Don't do it about the Chinese. You've got to deal with the government they've got now.
The regime has not changed. It is
Of course they've changed. How can you say they haven't changed from the Great Year Four? They denounced economic Marxism and introduced capitalism to grow their economy. Of course they changed.
Look, if all we're talking about is money and get-rich-quick schemes, you know, fine, OK, they've had capitalism, but I happen to think that humanity and treating people in a human fashion is far, far more important than anything you're talking about.
Well,
and China is still a country. China is still a country that forcibly detains Uyghurs in concentration camps. There was very strong evidence of this in a report from Sky News UK yesterday, pictures of these things. Plus, you know, the evidence about organ harvesting. It is not a nice place, Mark. I would like to think it was. I've spent a lot of time there. I've spent time in house arrest there. But it is fundamentally not a nice regime.
Yeah, well, Nick, I reckon your average Chinese, a fair bet your average Chinese looks at democratic practice around the world and says, well, if that's Brexit in the UK, what's happening to Trump? If that's democracy,
if you think
they don't mind their Confucian society where they respect authority. There's a level of respect for government. It's not your cup of tea, but no one's making you live there. I think we've got to respect other nations that do things differently, and their achievement to lift those people out of poverty is something you could never achieve with your style of politics, not in a million years. And they've done it, and I think it should be commended.
China would not have been in poverty if it hadn't been for communism in the first place. But if you think a way to maintain...
That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
If you think a way to